Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Matt Bowen. I'm a research scholar at the Center for Global Energy Policy at Columbia SIPA. Today, we're going to discuss the future of the U.S. nuclear waste program. Let me say quickly, this event is being webcast live, and the full video will be available online in the coming days. For those of you joining via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. For those of you watching the live stream anywhere else, you can submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag CJEPLive and the Twitter handle @ColumbiaUEnergy. We have a great group of panelists who know well more than I do about the various aspects of US nuclear waste management. And I will introduce them in a bit, but first I'm going to do an overview of the US nuclear waste program from a recent report I wrote and try to set up the discussion. Okay, so for many decades, there's been a scientific consensus that the long-lived radioactive isotopes in spent nuclear fuel, as well as the high-level radioactive waste from the reprocessing of spent nuclear fuel, can be safely isolated in geologic formations underground that have been stable for millions to hundreds of millions of years, long enough for even the exceedingly long half-lives of some of those radioactive isotopes to decay away. Using conventional mining techniques, such geologic formations could potentially provide an appropriate place for the disposal of spent nuclear fuel and high-level waste, subject to additional analysis of all of the features involved, the engineered barriers, the packages, flow of water through the site, et cetera. Ultimately, the objective is to lengthen the time, travel times away from the repository. The engineered barriers will eventually degrade, and at that point, the natural barriers will be the ones controlling the flow of radionuclides. It's not possible to go through all of US nuclear waste policy, and even what I'll cover will be necessarily brief, but I think to understand how we got to where we are, you at least need to go back to 1982 when the Nuclear Waste Policy Act was passed. That act laid out a timetable for studying locations, identifying two sites, and that's important that there were supposed to be two. By law, the president was to recommend to Congress those two sites by date certain. And there was even a cap placed on the first repository until the second one entered into operations. And there were some very understandable intents behind having two repositories. It was widely anticipated that the first one would be in the West, even though it was not required by law, and the second one would be in the East. There were two main divisions of nuclear waste that the act was supposed to take care of. So commercial spent nuclear fuel was supposed to actually be paid for by contracts that DOE entered into with utilities that charged a fee that would be paid into this new nuclear waste fund, nominally 0.1 cents per kilowatt hour, and DOE would take title to that commercial spent nuclear fuel in 1998. You know, an additional mission was the act was going to take care of the leftover high-level waste and some spent nuclear fuel from the nuclear weapons program, the arms buildup during the Cold War. The act allowed some flexibility for mingling the commercial and defense waste. It wasn't required. The Reagan administration felt there was some savings, and for a long time, that was the plan. However, 4 years later, while Secretary of Energy John Harrington was announcing a narrowing of the candidate sites for the first repository, he also announced that DOE was simply deferring the search for a second repository. It was widely perceived to be political. The administration contended it was based on a variety of other factors. The elected officials in the East, both Democrats and Republicans, cheered getting rid of the Eastern Repository Program, but the reaction was not the same in the West, where officials contended this was undoing an essential compromise that had gotten the act passed. This led to consideration in 1987 by Congress, amendments to the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. You can see Nevada saw pretty clearly what was likely to happen. Originally, the act required the final 3 candidates for the first repository to be characterized before the president would make a recommendation on a single site to Congress. But the final 3 sites weren't characterized, and the president ultimately didn't make a recommendation to Congress before Congress amended the act to focus on Yucca Mountain. A contributing factor was that the cost for characterizing the 3 sites had grown quite a lot. And I like this quote from Senator Bennett Johnston that also indicates cost was a factor, but that what ultimately happened in the conferencing of the legislation where the Yucca Mountain and Nevada were named was ultimately a political process. It also indicates it's not that the site wasn't thought well of, and it had actually scored well on a variety of assessments. And we'll have a member of Congress from the House side, actually, who can, on our panel, who can perhaps respond to Senator Johnson. Mo Udall was one of the principal architects of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, and at least this is how he felt after the amendments in '87, saying the program was in ruins. There isn't time to cover everything that's happened since then. I put a couple selected events below. The site was ultimately recommended to Congress by President Bush, and a license application to construct was submitted to the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The Obama administration sought to withdraw that license application and zeroed out the budget request for the program. Ultimately, the courts stepped in to stop collection of the Nuclear Waste Fund fees and also required the NRC to evaluate the Yucca Mountain application with at least the money that had been appropriated to date. That licensing wasn't finished, and the state had submitted, I think, over 200 contentions to the application, and there was over 300, I think, in total. The Trump administration came in and reinstated requests, budget requests for the project in the first 3 years, and then zeroed out the request in 2020, an election year. And I would say there's not an expectation that the Biden administration is going to request money for Yucca Mountain. So there have been no appropriations for the project since 2010, which kind of leads to the title of today's webinar, Where to Now for the US Nuclear Waste Program. I would argue a lot has changed since the 80s when the act was set up. I believe in '82 when it was passed, the defense inventory, we were running these production reactors. That may have actually even been the larger inventory at the time. It was certainly still increasing, but those have been shut down now, producing a relatively bounded defense inventory. We've also seen the opening of a deep geologic repository, just not one that was done through the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. The waste isolation pilot plant in New Mexico began disposal operations for defense-generated transuranic waste over 2 decades ago. It's a less radioactive form of nuclear waste. And they've successfully transported over 12,000 shipments to the site. I think Melanie will talk a little bit about that. Jim Hansen may have been testifying about climate change back in the 80s, but we really hadn't reached the point that we have now in terms of, countries like Japan, South Korea, China declaring they're going to be net zero carbon by 2050 or 2060. I think Tsinghua University in China declared, estimated China might need to quintuple its nuclear energy generation as part of meeting those goals. And of course, we have the Paris Agreement. We have states passing zero carbon or clean energy standards, and utilities declaring they're going to be zero carbon by date certain, which has also led to subsequent renewal licenses for existing nuclear plants to operate potentially out to 80 years. And then another difference from the 80s is now other countries have continued to make progress in their nuclear waste programs, and we stand to learn from some of those. I think Finland's acknowledged as kind of the international leader in geologic repository. development. They had a site selection process countrywide, and ultimately they had a municipal council vote in favor to proceed. And they have been in the process of building their repository with operations expected to begin in the next few years. So, in contrast to what things were like in the 80s, state and local officials could actually go to an operating geologic repository for commercial spent nuclear fuel, or to the waste isolation pilot plant in New Mexico to see for themselves how these projects operate, the risks and benefits, and assess them for themselves. I think if this quote was dated from a report in 2021, maybe nobody would blink. There are still some challenges that need to be addressed. And I think we need a program that's going to have greater continuity than what we've had, and also work on building trust. I outlined 6 options in the report, and I will briefly run through them so we can get to the panel discussion. Kind of as hinted on that previous quote, since before I was born, people have been recommending that you really want to implement the nuclear waste program outside of DOE or its predecessors. Here is suggested a federal corporation, but in the end, getting the program outside of Department of Energy, where you have all this competition for attention from the Secretary of Energy, changeovers in administrations every 4 or 8 years, assistant secretaries changing 2, 3, 4 years, greater continuity and a single-minded purpose to the program. People have been, these are 3 recommendations from a long time ago, but there have been more recent reports from MIT, the Blue Ribbon Commission, Stanford and GW. And I think we'll talk about this in the discussion. Consent-based maybe is a little bit charged, who consents when, but one aspect of the United States, we have this state level government between local and national, and that's one of the challenges I think will need to be addressed. One example that we could draw from, it's relatively close to home. There are dozens of countries that have nuclear power programs. They also have to address the nuclear waste challenge. Canada at some point in time realized that its program didn't enjoy confidence from its public. And in response to legislation in 2002, this Nuclear Waste Management Organization came to be, and they initiated a voluntary siting process. So very different than how we approached it in the 80s. 22 communities expressed interests, and they had a multi-stage, multi-phase program that ultimately down-selected in 2019 to considering 2 sites, and they expect to down-select to 1 in the next few years. I won't talk too much about this, but you can argue that the funding structure for the waste program contributed to the kind of standstill we reached. The program was supposed to be self-financed for the commercial nuclear waste. In part due to budget laws, there became this disconnect between the fee payments, which were ruled to be mandatory, and the spending, which was only discretionary. So you could have years where the utilities were paying over $700 million, and yet the appropriations for Yucca Mountain were $0. Due to our kind of arcane budget rules, in effect, the fees served to only offset a kind of larger bucket of spending, and the waste program still had to compete for budget space with other programs that weren't supposed to be self-financed. And unlike those other programs at DOE, which were intended to be paid out of general revenues and taxes, this program is to fulfill statutory and contractual obligations, and the failure to meet those is costing taxpayers billions of dollars from the judgment fund. So these are ideas from the past, and there are others to fix the budget structure. I won't spend too much time on them. I kind of hinted at before, we have shut off production reactors. We have all this defense waste. There's at least been the suggestion that the restriction of WIP's mission to defense waste may have contributed to greater acceptance. And perhaps there's an argument for pursuing disposal of defense waste first. The inventory itself is smaller. It is relatively bounded with the exception of a small amount of Navy fuel generated by aircraft carriers and submarines each year. Overall, it's cooler and less radioactive. Because the plutonium's been removed, there's less of an argument for reuse. And it could be potentially a capacity confidence building step for the United States. Melanie will talk a bit about transportation, so I'll just say in advance of a transportation campaign to either consolidate interim storage site or a disposal site, there are a variety of actions that DOE and Congress could take. Groups like the National Academies and the Western Interstate Energy Board, where Melanie works, have published reports with action items that DOE and Congress could review and take action where they see it necessary. Another lighter lift action than creating a whole new waste management organization, the standards for generic repositories were first promulgated in the 80s. Later, Congress directed EPA and NRC to develop regulations for Yucca Mountain. So going forward for new repository sites, we probably do want to set out the generic repository standards to be sure that we're not in the future having to make changes, or that we do make changes in the future that are perceived to in any way being adjusted for specific sites. And that's something that the Biden administration or Congress could direct the relevant agencies to do. And then finally, under a full consent-based program, I would guess Nye County, where Yucca Mountain is, would want to be part of that. I doubt, simply because it's a consent-based program, the state's going to feel particularly different and just consent to go forward with the project as it was proposed. So I suggest this as kind of a very broad proposal that could go any number of different ways. A majority of counties suggested or indicated they would like to see the licensing of Yucca Mountain finished. I don't think the state would just do that. I think they would want something in return. So I at least suggested you could negotiate an agreement that has elements of the Nuclear Waste Informed Consent Act, this legislation that the Nevada congressional delegation has introduced. You could include that, elements of that, as part of perhaps a negotiated agreement to give Nevada consent on the other side of licensing. A different direction you could go is try to address Nevada's contentions, stated concerns regarding transportation routes, repository design details, restrict transportation corridors, pursue perhaps a much smaller 1/10, 1/20th the size program, which would sort of generically reduce risks. And could ask the national academies to take a look at how these risks are changed by these design details. You could pursue disposal of the cooler, less radioactive defense waste, maybe make use of backfill to address seismic concerns. Anyway, I also suggested you could perhaps negotiate these details in a legally binding agreement so that the state wouldn't be worried that in agreeing to do anything, it might at a later time be forced to do more. And I do think one helpful step regardless would be eliminating the restriction of provisions in the Nuclear Waste Policy Act that singled out Nevada and Yucca Mountain. So with that, let me turn back to bring on our panels. Again, for those watching online, my name is Matt Bowen. We're going to bring on Tito Bonanno from Sandia National Labs, Phil Sharp, former representative, Melanie Snyder, who works at the Western Interstate Energy Board. We're discussing the future of the US nuclear waste program. Well, now I'm going to ask each of the panelists one question before we open up to questions from the audience. For those of you joining via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. You can also submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag CJEPLive and the Twitter handle @ColumbiaUEnergy. I believe the speaker order is somewhat random. So first up, Tito Bonanno is Senior Manager of the Nuclear Energy Fuel Cycle Program at Sandia National Labs. He is responsible for a group that conducts research and development and advanced technologies for both the front and back end of the nuclear fuel cycle to ensure energy and environmental stability in the interest of national security. He has programmatic responsibility within Sandia's energy and homeland security portfolio for the back end of the nuclear fuel cycle and the commercial nuclear power generation subprogram areas. Tito has a BS in chemical engineering from the University of Puerto Rico and MS and PhD degrees in chemical engineering from Clarkson University. Tito?
Thanks, Matt. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Again, thank you for the invitation to participate in the webinar. As Matt says, I'm Tito Bonanno, Senior Manager for the Nuclear Energy Fuel Cycle Programs at Sandia National Labs. And I want to preamble my brief remarks with a note that Sandia is a federally funded research and development center. And as such, we're not in a position to offer opinions or make recommendations on policy matters. Therefore, my remarks today and my response to any questions I may get will be primarily of a technical nature. I want to cover two topics if I have plenty of time available. One of them is what is the situation currently with respect to managing spent nuclear fuel from commercial nuclear power generation. And again, if time permits, the need for engaging in a proactive knowledge management program. So the current situation in the US is that, as Matt was pointing out in his introductory remarks, we do not have an operational geologic repository for the permanent disposal of commercial nuclear fuel. As a result of that, nuclear utilities in the US have been forced to establish on-site what are called independent spent fuel storage installations. Again, these are located within the boundaries of each one of the nuclear power plants. And that includes even nuclear power plants that the reactors have been decommissioned and they no longer have an operating reactor. Because the storage pools as these power plants are at maximum capacity, in order to make room for fresh out of reactor fuel, the older, cooler fuel needs to be removed from the pools and loaded into what we call dry storage canister systems. These systems are called dual purpose canisters, or DPCs for short, and primarily because they have been designed and certified by the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission for both dry storage and transportation. However, the DPCs are not designed for permanent disposal. So the current situation in the US right now is that we basically have temporary storage of commercial fuel in 75 reactor sites located around 33 states, most of which are located east of the Mississippi. As I said earlier, most of these reactor pools have reached capacity and utilities have implemented dry storage systems. Some facilities will shut down reactors. All that remains is stranded fuel in one of those independent storage fuel installations. The current fleet of reactors in the US is generating approximately 2,200 metric tons of commercial spent nuclear fuel every year. Currently, there is around 86,000 metric tons of this fuel in storage. About a third of that is in these dry storage systems. We expect that by mid-century, around 2050, 2060, we'll have roughly about 136 to 1,000 to about 140,000 tons of this, metric tons of this SNF in storage. The issue right now that we're facing is that because there is no operating repository, we are loading more and more of these dry storage systems. Just to give you an example, back around the time when the construction authorization application for the Yucca Mountain repository was submitted to the NRC, there were about 1,100 of these dual purpose canisters in service. The vast majority of the fuel that was in storage was in the pools. Fast forward to 2020, December of 2020, we now have about 3,300 of these dry storage systems in service. And by mid-century, we expect to have about 10,000 of them. Usually, these are very large canisters. They are, some of the largest ones can accommodate up to about 36 pressurized water reactor assemblies. They come in about 30 different basic designs. They can be stored vertical above ground, vertical below ground, and horizontally. The vast majority of them are welded lids, although we have a small percentage which are bolted lids. The situation is, again, because the current practice, while it's being safe, it's being optimized for reactor site operations, and the current practice is not optimized for transportation and disposal. As we continue to load some of these gas, the nuclear utilities continue to do that. At the end of the day, we may be left with three options: either opening the fuel, the canisters, and repackaging the fuel into disposal canisters, constructing one or more repositories that can accommodate these dual purpose canisters, or storing the fuel at these surface storage facilities for much longer than they were anticipated. So some of the research that we have ongoing at this time is looking at three things. Number one, how can we understand the behavior of these canisters when they are likely to be in service much longer than they were originally anticipated for? What are the issues that may affect their integrity? Stress corrosion cracking, aging management issues, and things of that are things that we're paying attention to. We're also looking at, can we actually dispose of these dual purpose canisters directly in a geologic repository without having to open them and repackage the fuel? Some of the things that we're looking at is the conduct of post-closure criticality consequence analysis. We're looking at, can we fill the DPCs with fillers that will provide criticality controls? We're also dealing with enhancements options for existing and future canisters, as well as looking at some of the geotechnical considerations for post-closure safety performance in a geologic repository, thermal management, the size and weight of these canisters, and things of that nature. So we're looking at this. At the same time, we're looking at the issues associated with transportation of the fuel after they've been in storage for longer than we originally anticipated. And we're doing a significant amount of testing associated with understanding the behavior of the canisters and the fuel assemblies during normal conditions of transport, as well as potential issues if the canisters were to be dropped accidentally. There are some of the issues that we're addressing. The one thing that I think also presents a potential risk moving forward is the fact that most of the experts that came of age, so to speak, in the 80s and 90s, working in the repository program at the time, those individuals now are retiring or out of retirement age. And we as a nation are at a high risk of losing a lot of what I refer to as tacit knowledge, the experience and expertise that those individuals have in their minds that will walk away at the time that they retire. So I think one of the key issues that the US needs to institute is a very proactive and decisive knowledge management project to ensure that we at least are able to capture the tacit knowledge and the expertise and experiences that those individuals are gained through their 30, 40 years careers in the nuclear waste management programs. And with that, I'll conclude my remarks, and then I will be happy to answer any questions that are posed to me later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tito. Next, Phil Sharp serves on advisory committees to Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy, MIT's Energy Initiative, Harvard's Institute of Politics, After a decade as president of Resources for the Future, he retired in 2016. For 20 years, he was a member of Congress where he chaired the Energy and Power Subcommittee, which had jurisdiction over the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission and nuclear waste policy. He helped negotiate the House Senate 1987 Nuclear Waste Policy Act amendments. He was a member of the Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future that was set up in the Obama administration, as well as he was on the Secretary of Energy Advisory Board's Task Force on Advanced Nuclear Technology. He has a PhD from Georgetown University. Phil? Phil, I think you're still muted. Oh.
Yeah, there we are. Matt, thank you so much, and congratulations on this paper. I think it's really provides a very useful summary of history and some of the key policy questions that we confront today, and therefore is useful to policymakers, stakeholders, probably teachers, and students that are interested in this esoteric and complicated proposition. And I also feel it's very timely because I believe hope springs eternal, and that with the new administration and the passage of time on this issue, I think we're at a new point where we might get some real action. And I'll talk about why I think that's the case later. But right now, I just want to focus on and carry out a little more on what you gave a brief summary of some of the changes since the 1980s as to what the status of things now. And I want to focus on more the political side of what people were thinking about then and now, which suggests to me why I'm more hopeful than that. I mean, Tito says it's very important to preserve all this knowledge, and he's certainly right about that on the technical side. On the political side, I had an old professor who suggested that progress often follows the hearse. And so we may find that we're ready, able to deal with this now that more and more people have been moved out of the way in the political system. But apart from that joke, let me go back to the 1980s. And this is not to justify what the decisions were, but to add a little color to understanding why that and what happened and why distrust developed. First of all, it's very important to remember how nuclear power in this country developed. It was fundamentally a national security issue under the Manhattan Project, and it was therefore wrapped in secrecy from the outset. And it's been very reluctantly for generations to shed that secrecy kind of proposition. And in addition to that, of course, it was basically federal government stimulus to the whole issue of, and also moving into the private sector with the power generation, but it was to be exclusively regulated by the Atomic Energy Commission, by the federal government, in other words. In fact, it's one of the few places in energy law where you find an absolute state preemption, which prevents states from regulating radionuclides and most of the construction and whatnot of a nuclear power plant. And so what you have is this legacy of defense and defense secrecy, this legacy of the federal government. And you also have, of course, a new science, a very highly technical, which leads to lots of technical issues, which frankly is just not acceptable to a lot of us common folk. And therefore, there was a great tendency to have a legacy of arrogance and indifference toward local communities and state governments. Trust us, we know best. Now, not everybody took that point of view, but I think that's what you would find many states and local governments saying is, excuse me, by the 1980s, trust me was running out. The Cold War was less virulent, and certainly the World War II was finished at that point. Now, we fully expected in that time that there would be NIMBY problems. They were in every energy sector, problems of not in my backyard, don't do it here. And with nuclear waste, it of course has some very special qualities that make that so. So the question was, what was the approach to this going to be? And the approach, instead of what now is being advocated these days, instead of, well, let's start out on a cooperative engagement basis that leads to some kind of agreement as to what it is, it was, no, we'll start out, we'll tell you what it ought to be, and we may let you in under the tent a few times, but we'll decide. And this leads to the structure that you find in the, I think it's in the 82 Act, and certainly it's in the 87 amendments, that what will happen is with Yucca Mountain, or previously the 3 sites, is the president will make an initial determination. It will be submitted to the Congress, and the Congress will vote on it. After, but it's submitted, that the state is given a chance to veto that. But then the veto would be overridden by the Congress and the president, establishing the compelling national security and security issues that were involved in this. Now, notice a lot of that was believed to be every governor is going to have to say, not in my backyard. So the anticipation was probably every governor, wherever it was going to be, and certainly in Nevada, was going to object. But then the governor, in theory, some would have argued at the time, I'm not sure everybody would have, but would have argued at the time, well, but the governor, once confronted, will have to say, well, they made me do it, so now let's cooperate, let's get something out of it, kind of proposition, and opposition would fade. Well, we know that didn't happen. I might also add that I doubt that anybody in that room, when I was part of the negotiation of the so-called Stick It to Nevada, that was not how we termed it, but that's how outsiders later declared, was we had no idea Harry Reid was going to become the Senate majority leader, and therefore you wouldn't have to even think about local opposition to it. You had a well-established and very powerful senator who was able to affect the appropriations and any legislative action on this. Well, if we turn to today, and part of why I think there's real policy possibilities, and here's one that, let me put it this way, it may be a perverted argument, but as you point out, there is no compelling crisis reason for the government to rush into a new thing. It's not crippling the economy or any part of the economy. It's not, have a severe safety question that we've got to resolve right away. And yet, most of us would argue, as you in the paper, there are really strong, good reasons that we should be developing this policy. It's going to take time no matter what. A second thing is, and by the way, what that means is it's not as salient. And it means that people can work on this without it having to be a life or death political situation. And nobody is, anyway, I think that actually has a value in not having that intensity of problem. The second thing, though, is that obviously, as you point out, the nature of concern about nuclear power has been shifting. And so with the severe concern, which I think is really called for, about climate change, nuclear is re-evolving as a more acceptable form, and certainly has fewer opponents than it had at that time. Now, why that's relevant is, in part, there was a stream of opposition which just took the point of view, anything you can do to gum up the waste disposal works helps make sure you don't get any new plants. And obviously this actually became the law in the state of California and one or two other states, that until you solve that, you cannot have another plant. That's just almost irrelevant today, but of course right now the finances is slowing up new plants. And just to add to this, if you took Fukushima, you would think that we would have had the revival of a significant anti-nuclear movement, as you did in Japan. But in fact, that's not what happened. There were lots of actions that had to be taken because of Fukushima, but in fact, it did not lead to this political severe problem for the industry, not in individual plant areas or in some of the rules changes at the NRC. And even if you go to Japan today, I think you got about 9 of their reactors operating again. They were down to about 4, and now they're trying to restart others. So slowly they are actually moving back into the arena. A third thing is that pretty much was viewed back then that it was an economic albatross. That certainly was one of the arguments on NIMBY, that if you took on this, you would, who would come gamble in Los Angeles or Las Vegas if you had this? I always believe that was the weak argument, but because I think people were going to gamble no matter what, and they weren't going to pay attention. but that's my view. But there was the issue on transportation of, was it dangerous to run the trains through the city or near the city? I don't know what the rail transportation is there. And that was probably a legitimate concern. But the point is that now, especially with this experience with WIP in New Mexico, there's a lot more positive that can be said about it. And frankly, everybody thinks you ought to try to make more out of the economic benefits. And then there's as you already indicated, there's the real world example of WIP, the Waste Isolation Project in New Mexico, which really provides a chance for people to see how it operates and provided a chance to learn more about how state and federal and local people can interact. And so you can see that. And I think also, again, what was reflected in your paper, but it's in the BRC report and any number of these other reports, is there really is a very broad-based consensus on how to approach governance, not in specific ways, but in a general way. And that is that let's start with an engagement with the local government and the state government, and you build up consent, you build up transparency, you build up trust. And the actual arrangements that are going to govern this are a negotiated proposition. They're not set down from courts, or they're not set down from the Congress. You're going to negotiate those in a way to hopefully lead to some kind of accommodation. Well, let me just add one more, and then I'll close and answer questions for as you get to that. One thing is to remember too, which you alluded to and Tito was talking about, which is there's a lot of useful work on these issues that has been going on. It hasn't been just paralysis kind of proposition. And at the NRC, at the DOE, at the study just of canisters, as Tito was talking about, but even at Congress, last fall, in this era of political polarization and constipation in Congress, we had this massive appropriations bill pass. And guess what? For the first time in years, they appropriated some money out of the nuclear waste fund. Now, admittedly, it was only $7.5 million, but there was a whole broader $27 million appropriated. But the point is, there is activity going forward, and there is a willingness to engage that one might be a little surprised to find. And also, we have a private sector initiative going on not on the deep geologic disposal, but upon consolidated interim disposal in both New Mexico and Texas. And one of the questions already in the box was whether they thought the new administration would block the effort to get licensing for these two different sites that are actually very close to each other. There's just a cross-state border from each other. And I'll give you a quick opinion. I personally would find it outrageous if they just took a political point of view on that. I think we do want the NRC to technically review and make a determination. Getting a license will not guarantee the building of these things, but it is a critical step. So with that, let me just say that I think there's a proposition, and later we maybe can talk about why I have the insane view that it's in the political interest of the Secretary of Energy to help pursue this.
Okay, thank you, Phil. And now Melanie Snyder is the Western Interstate Energy Board Nuclear Waste Transportation and Disposition Program Manager. She provides subject matter and policy expertise, guidance, and coordination for the WEB's High-Level Radioactive Waste Committee, which is composed of representatives from 11 Western states. Melanie is one of the primary interfaces between federal, state, tribal, industry, and other entities on high-level policy issues related to nuclear waste, with a focus on transportation. Melanie is an attorney with a JD and a BS in chemistry from the University of Denver. Melanie.
Thank you, Matt. Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today with my distinguished co-panelists to help Matt roll out his new nuclear waste report and to talk to you all a little bit my favorite topic, which is spent nuclear fuel transportation. And I'd like to start by offering a framing of this issue, particularly for everyone on this who may not be as familiar with the topic. So I'd like to ask everyone to think about planning an out-of-town weekend trip with their significant other. Think about all the planning that has to go into making this trip successful. There are the logistical considerations, how are we getting there? Are you taking a car, flying, taking a train? How you get around when you get there? What will you do when you get there? And what do you need to pack? What can and can't you bring? There's those security considerations when you're flying. What will the weather be like at your destination? Where will you be staying? What likely contingencies do you need to plan for? Because everyone who's ever taken a trip ever knows that things never go perfectly as planned. Think about how far in advance you'd like to start planning to make this trip successful, and how much coordination and communication you need to have with your significant other for things to go smoothly. Certainly people have different ideas about how much coordination and how much advanced planning you might need for your preferred trip, but you will have to have some for everyone to enjoy this trip. So now let's change the hypothetical a little bit. Now, instead of a weekend trip with your significant other, you're planning a 2-week trip in a foreign country with 10 of your friends. Now, we've significantly upped the complexity of this trip, and we've obviously significantly upped the amount of coordination and communication and advanced planning that needs to take place for this trip to be successful. So now, how far in advance would you like to start planning for this trip? Maybe a year out? Maybe longer than that? How much time do you think you're going to have to spend communicating with those 10 people? How many text messages and calls and emails are you going to have? It's going to be quite a bit. So I'm sure everyone kind of sees where I'm going with this. Let's change the hypothetical one more time. Now we're not taking a 2-week trip with 10 friends. We're planning to take thousands of highly radioactive, 12-foot long spent fuel rods on a trip to their new home, whether that be interim storage or a permanent repository. So some questions you are going to have to answer for this. How are you going to get them there safely? Are they being driven? Are they taking a train? Are they taking a boat? Some combination of all 3 of those? Do they need to be packed in? And what needs to be brought along? What route are they going to be taking to their destination? How long is it going to take? What is the weather going to be like along the way? Who's going with? And which rods move first, second, third? What is that coordination going to look like? And this all leads us to the biggest question, which is how far in advance do you want to start planning for this trip? How much coordination and communication with how many people do you think it's going to take to make all of these trips successful? It's going to be quite a bit. So I offer this as what I hope is a more useful framing of the transportation issue, because I feel like too often the debate is really reduced to the very simple question of, can it be done safely or not? And it's fairly obvious that it has been done safely and it can be done safely, but the devil is in the details. And the sooner you start working out the details with the people that will be responsible for the transportation, the more smoothly the transport is going to be. And that is really what I see as the heart of Matt's transportation recommendation in this report, which is that the federal government or whoever is planning on conducting this transportation should take whatever advanced steps that they can now to start preparing for this very large scale transportation program. Because yes, spent fuel has been moved safely and uneventfully in many places across the world for many years, but the magnitude of the transportation to move all of the spent fuel in the US to one centralized place has not yet happened and needs to be very, very well planned. For example, I like that Mike has highlighted the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant or WIP transportation program in this report because it happens to be my favorite transportation program. And for those of you who are not familiar with WIP, it is a permanent repository mined in salt in New Mexico for what's called transuranic waste, which is a specific kind of nuclear waste that has been generated from the US's nuclear weapons programs. And it's transported to WIP primarily from the national lab sites where it was generated, such as Idaho and Savannah River in South Carolina. And the transportation program that has governed the thousands of shipments to WIP since 1999 has been resoundingly successful. Why? At least in part because of the coordination and communication with all of the requisite people that took place to plan the program. And these conversations are still happening. For example, every month, a group of Western state representatives and DOE staff who are engaged in WIP transportation have a call to discuss shipments. Any issues, any things that need to be tweaked, any information that needs to be shared among the group. And this is still happening for a transportation program that's over 20 years old and very well established. And this, in the minds of the Western states, which I represent on this issue, and in my own mind, is the model for how to plan for future spent fuel shipments. Do as much planning as you can, even without a destination, but certainly as soon as a destination is found, bring all of the necessary parties together and begin planning for how to make this transportation program as safe and successful as possible. So there's two other things that I'd like to say before I turn the podium back over to Matt. The first is directed at those in the audience who live and breathe this issue every day and who indulge in some dismissive hand waving when others raise concerns over the safety of spent fuel transportation. And what I would say to these people is that the powers that have generated spent fuel are the same powers that have been used to destroy cities and end wars, and the same powers that hold nations in check and inspire existential fear of doomsday in millions of people. It is not ignorant to fear nuclear things. Rather than dismissing people's legitimate fears, let's build a program that builds trust, not just in transportation, but in all aspects of spent fuel and nuclear management. And part of building this trust is building the communication and the coordination with all the people that are responsible for nuclear management so that they can go and share that confidence in these programs with everyone they speak to and interact with. And the other thing I would like to say is more directed at policymakers, which is just that Matt's report is another valuable contribution to what seems to me to be a growing consensus about how to move forward with the US nuclear waste program. And I hope that you all are listening and that you choose to act soon.
Okay, thank you, Melanie. I will now ask one question from each of the panelists before opening up the discussion to the audience Q&A. So first one to Tito. So I mentioned those regulations that were first published in the 1980s for generic repositories. Can you talk a little bit about how maybe international thinking on repository standards has changed, why we might want to do that update ahead of a new search? You'd mentioned workforce issues. Could this be something that helps engage folks that we have in the workforce?
Sure, Matt, be happy to. So first of all, let me start my response by saying, I started my career working in some of those regulations and standards back in the early 80s. So that's kind of dates me a little bit. I'm a very strong proponent. That's okay. I'm okay with that, Melanie. I'm a very strong proponent of taking a look at those generic standards. I will have a caveat, which I will add. Yes, so first of all, there's been a lot of advancement, not only internationally, but even in the US. The NRC is more of a risk-informed regulatory body these days, as opposed to where they were back in the 80s, when, for example, 10 CFR Part 60, which is the generic regulation for spent fuel and hazardous waste disposal, was first developed. So I think there is a need to certainly take a look at developing more risk-informed regulations. We have, we have a much better understanding, both from a lot of international activities, at the International Energy Agency in Vienna, the Nuclear Energy Agency in Paris have been looking at the evolution of, regulatory frameworks. We're now talking about other disposal methods, like potentially like the borehole disposal, as opposed to a mine geologic repository. Things that we've added to, for example, you mentioned in your remarks that now the Yucca Mountain site-specific regulations and standards look at 1 million years, which is basically related to the period of geologic stability of those sites. So there's been a number of changes over the last 30 to 40 years that I think warrant taking a look at generic repositories, generic regulations, excuse me. One caveat that I would make is that we need to also be careful that we don't generate unintended consequences. And specifically, 40 CFR Part 191, which is the EPA standards, health standards for generic standards, the website was certified using 40 CFR 191. And in revising those standards, we need to be careful that we do not cause a situation where the certification of WIP gets put in jeopardy. So there are a number of factors. I'm a proponent of taking a look at the regulations, and we will need a new one, a generic regulation. So yes, I'm a proponent of that. But at the same time, we need to be careful that we don't create some unintended consequences, like putting an operating repository in jeopardy. I don't know whether that answers your question.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Okay. I'll ask a question to Phil next. So you were a member of the Blue Ribbon Commission during the Obama administration, and you all recommended this consent-based citing. And I'm curious to hear kind of how you think about that in the United States, where we have federal, state, and local entities. So we don't have, it's not like in Finland where there's no in between. It's just the national and local governments. And, it seems pretty clear there'll be some local governments who are interested to host. What do we need to do as far as engaging states? Do we need to engage national governors associations, or state, national council on legislatures?
Well, certainly those are part of it. But the first thing we have to do is reject what was a notion that some people talk about because they're not as fully conversant with the American constitutional law. And that is that, if we get local agreement, then they and the federal government go forward. Just not the case. The truth is local government gets its authority and jurisdictions originally from the state government, and the state government has the police powers over health and safety and things like that kind of proposition. So you're not going to be able to bypass the state governments and shouldn't try. In fact, part of what I hope I was articulating was it was a mistake not to take this more seriously at the outset back in the 80s of this. So I don't think there's any magic to that, but I do think that's where you begin with a negotiated proposition with local governments, with state governments, and with getting, as you say, a whole variety of stakeholders involved. And one of your questioners rightfully raised the fact that I had not mentioned the question of safety of the workers or safety of the population, which has to be number one. And I really do believe that, even though it may not have sounded like it when I was focused on trying to solve the political equation that is going to be difficult. But partly the way you do that, and partly it's through the negotiation, and partly what the experience we've had is you institute institutional propositions that help make sure that local citizens get information, get input, get scientific help, and can raise the questions in a serious and timely way. Just a couple quick examples. One of the good things we did in 1987, but unfortunately it was 20 years too late, was we established the Nuclear Waste Technical Review Board, which was an independent scientific review board in which either citizens or other players in the system could raise questions and say, we don't trust the science that they're telling us out of the studies about Yucca Mountain. We want this to be independently reviewed, this particular issue. Another way is even more at home, which is what WIP did, which is they have an interesting negotiation between New Mexico and the federal government with an independent medical center there. And I think they call the program Lay Down and Be Counted, in which any citizen in the area can bring in their children and themselves and get medical people to review whether they have been absorbing, whether they know whether they've absorbed any radiation from the trucks that come through or anything of the sort. Now, these aren't going to work as perfect things, but they do help maintain trust, and they do help assure citizens that they're not just being manipulated by economic or political powerhouses.
Okay, thanks. And then question for Melanie. So the Nuclear Waste Policy Act was set up so that the costs of managing commercial spent nuclear fuel were going to be paid for by the generators of the waste. as far as you have states where commercial spent nuclear fuel might be traversing, can you talk about some of the activities that states undertake to facilitate that transportation, the exercises that are run, the training, and ultimately the costs that states incur as part of that, managing the transportation and the challenge that comes with trying to get reimbursed by the federal government for those costs, in part due to the language in the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, which I believe WEB has recommended be changed.
Yes, yeah, thank you, Matt. So the language that you're referring to is colloquially or specifically known as Section 180C of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. And this provides that the federal government will fund the states and tribes for some preparedness activities, but the language only says training. And it has long been the position of the states and the tribes that that is only very narrow definition of what needs to happen in order for there to be a full preparedness program. So for instance, training, you're talking about training emergency responders to be able to respond in the event of an emergency. Something happens to the train that's carrying the spent nuclear fuel. You want the people who are going to respond to be prepared to deal with the special situation of radioactive materials, even if there's no actual dispersal of radioactive materials. So you're training these emergency responders. One of the things you're going to want to train them on is how to use radiation detection equipment. Well, what radiation detection equipment are you going to be using to train them on? Do the emergency responders have the equipment? Does everybody have the same equipment? Because it's not going to be a very effective training if you're not using the same equipment. These things don't all work in the same ways. There's analog and digital devices and all different kinds of things. So equipment is an example of another cost that the states would incur in order to be properly prepared to respond into an emergency involving a spent nuclear fuel shipment that the training piece just doesn't fully provide for. And there's all different kinds of examples of the kinds of activities and the kinds of things that need to be funded in order for there to be appropriate preparedness for an emergency response. So things you also mentioned, exercises that bring everyone together who would be involved in a transportation emergency response, so that they know who they would need to be talking to, so that people can kind of clarify what their roles would be, because there's a lot of different groups that could be involved. DOE has their own radiological emergency response team. The states have some, the railroads have their own response. What does that coordination look like? Again, there's a bunch of coordination that needs to happen. So that narrow scope of definition in Section 180C, as you say, the Western Interstate Energy Board has recommended that language be expanded to include all the kinds of preparedness activities that the states would need and the tribes would need.
Okay, thanks. With that, we'll move to audience Q&A. I can already see we have 50 questions. We're not going to get to everything, but that's great. So I'll just sort of take these questions and distribute them unless folks jump in and say they want to answer a particular question. We have a question: do new reactor designs produce lower amounts of waste and with less half-life? Which I'll sort of ask Tito if he could weigh in on some of these advanced reactor designs, maybe with or without reprocessing. Is that going to improve our waste management situation?
Well, so I think there is a lot of interest these days in how do we manage, first of all, understanding how advanced reactors, what kind of waste they're going to provide or produce, and what are the best alternatives to address those issues. I know that my team at Sandia, as well as working with colleagues at other national labs, just in December, we finished a study that was actually a webinar that I think was may have been recorded, funded by ARPA-E, as a way to start understanding and addressing the issues with waste forms that new reactors are likely to generate. One of the things that will have to be addressed, in my opinion, is to get a better understanding. You know, there's a plethora of a lot of these new reactors being considered. A lot of them, frankly, are paper designs at this time. So we don't know much about them. We know some of the, you know, some of the categories of the reactors in general terms, but a lot of the details about, you know, how much, for example, there are reactors right now who are interested in taking the spent fuel from CANDU reactors in Canada and use them as reactors, you know, fuel for and then generate different waste forms. The answer to the question is yes, there is a lot of interest going on. There are people who are thinking about it, including, you know, my team at the lab at Sandia and our colleagues at other national laboratories. And we're hoping that in the next few years, we'll have a better handle on what kind of waste forms these reactors are going to generate. I mean, there are some additional concerns that we're looking at. Some of these reactors are likely to use, like, for example, high assay, low enriched uranium. And of course, associated with some of this is the potential safeguards or proliferation risk issues that will need to be addressed. So there is a lot of factors to consider, but it's an area of current research and interest. And like I said, my team is looking into it. But we don't have a lot definitive in terms of definitive answers at this time to give a good informed answer to your question.
Okay. I see a question. Matt Bowen mentioned the need for a consent-based process.
I think Melanie has her.
I had a follow-up question for you, Tito,
sure.
actually.
Sure.
Is disposal a part of the consideration when new fuel types are being licensed? Is that something
yes.
that's
yes.
evaluated?
I know, for example, in Canada, let me give you as an example right now. In Canada, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, you know, part of their requirements for an advanced reactor is that they have a disposal plan in place.
Excellent.
So, yeah.
Okay. I see a question. Matt Bowen mentioned the need for a consent-based process. So can you indicate what types of communities are potentially welcoming the prospect of hosting nuclear waste for a few millennia, and are such communities typically united in their views? Maybe I'll ask Phil if you could talk about.
Actually, believe it or not, there were 3 or 4 communities that came forth over the last several years to suggest to DOE that they're willing to talk about it. That doesn't mean they're willing to agree to it. And we do have the Carlsbad, which is on the edge of the WIP system, in which it's a very positive climate there. I'm sure it doesn't have universal agreement. And I think one thing you have to understand is you're never going to get that. And to be frank about it, I don't think most of them are thinking in terms of millennia kind of issues anyway. But I don't mean to dismiss that as trivial. But what I'm saying is, one of the practical problems here is we're going to have to make a thing and figuring out what is consensus, a matter of just getting a local referendum in which 51% of the people say yes. I hardly think that's why I think it has to be a negotiated over time, which allows participation and sets up institutions that continue it. But really what we have found, to be honest with you, is it's the same with nuclear power plants as well as with WIP, is that in the areas where they exist, they're actually polled very well in terms of public support of the people that are most possibly affected and who also benefit the most from the jobs or from the tax base or other things.
Okay. We have a question. Did you say that the current dry canisters are not okay for transportation? I don't know when, during whose talk, but I see transportation. So I'm thinking, Melanie, I don't know if you can talk about the dry casks that are at plant sites and any related transportation issues. Are those suitable for transporting to consolidated interim storage or to a disposal site?
To my understanding, some are and some aren't. Some need to sit for longer before they will meet the transportation requirements. And I think some are not licensed specifically for transport. They're not built for that.
Can I ask Tito a question along those lines? Tito, as you answer that, is how much worry do we have to put into the fact that over time these canisters surely deteriorate, and how easy is it to redo them or whatnot? This goes to the question of having longer term consolidated storage.
Okay, so let me add something to Melanie's comment if I can, and then Phil, I'll come to your question. For sources, I think Melanie's correct. Not all the dry storage canisters have been licensed for transportations. The ones that are commonly known, which are more of the more recent designs of dual purpose canisters, they have been certified by the NRC for both dry storage and transportation. However, to date, I don't know if any one of those canisters have actually been used to transport fuel. They certainly are storing the fuel, but they haven't been used for a transportation campaign. Certainly the question is when, how ready we are. And I think, Melanie, you're correct. I think as the utilities go to higher burn-ups of the fuel fuel is hotter, and the surface temperature of these dry storage canisters is higher. And there they are, NRC and the Department of Transportation has specific requirements that have to be met in terms of the temperature, the surface temperatures of the canisters before they can actually be transported. So those are issues that we're looking at, which then comes back to your question, Phil. Certainly, I think we anticipate that these canisters are going to be in service longer than there was anticipated. So right now, the industry, the federal government, a number of international organizations are working in understanding better and developing aging management practices to understand the behavior of these canisters. The Electoral Power Research Institute has a collaborative program called the Extended Storage Collaborative Program that is one of the issues that they're looking at are aging management. And they have industry folks there. The Department of Energy participates, the NRC participates, as well as international organizations. One of the areas that we're looking at in our program, funded by the Department of Energy, is understanding the corrosion behavior of these canisters. As a matter of fact, at Sandia, we just received 8 unirradiated canisters that we're using to really understand. And we're going to be doing all sorts of testing with them over the next 3 to 5 years to really understand the behavior of these canisters, especially when they get located near marine environments, for example. Near marine environments. And things like that. So
salt.
Yeah. And so it's an area of active research right now that we're trying to understand better. And we're working with our colleagues at other national labs. So I think we share about 15 of these canisters that were made available to us. And we're going to be playing all sorts of games with them.
Okay. Question. Hi, Mr. Bonanno. Would it be possible to go into detail of how we are planning to manage a very critical issue of nuclear waste knowledge management? Thanks in advance.
Oh, excellent question. I mean, I got to tell you, as I approached my retirement age, knowledge management has become one of my passions. Knowledge management work is not easy. Let me start by saying that. We at Sandia, we have a couple of different projects associated with this. The most critical one is making sure that, folks like myself and others, that when we walk away, all the experience that we gain over so many years doesn't walk away with us. So you have to be very deliberate about it. I can tell you what we have done at Sandia, and I don't want to make this as part of an advertisement. I'm going to say, a lot of entities, both in the US and outside the US, are talking about knowledge management. We had a situation in my program at Sandia where a lot of people were retiring. So we had to stop the bleeding of tacit knowledge. And we went ahead and instituted a program. We did a little bit of research, but we needed to stop the bleeding. And we basically designed a program that is just 2 years old, where we engage a lot of things. We engage the experienced technical experts, but we also engage our target audience, which is what we call our early and mid-career staff, who have been in our program less than 10 years. And one of the key issues that we found is that you need to, understand you cannot share every piece of information. It's just impossible. So you need to understand what is the right information they need, when do they need it, what is the right format to make it available to them, and how do you make sure that they're going to use it. And so we started a program like that, and we did a lot of workshops, interactive workshops, not just somebody sitting in front of a camera and giving a lecture. These were live interactive workshops where the question and answer was the most valuable part of that. We had an expert come and present a few pointers about a given topic, okay, and then the rest of the session was about Q&A, because we wanted to set up a baseline for what people were interested in. All of those were recorded, and things like that. And then we're now doing what we call deep dives, where we're looking at very, very, a matter of fact, I'm just working on one next week, where we are taking a specific topic and spending anywhere from 4 to 5 hours engaging with our target audience to share our experience, but also to get, what is that they need. It is, I can go on talking about knowledge management till the cows come home, but it is something that is really important. You have to be very deliberate. You need to have money to do it, because it's not cheap, and you have to be explicit and proactive about it. And otherwise we are at risk of losing all that information.
Okay. I have a question from the audience. Any possibility that a federal public enterprise corporation could be established to manage U.S. nuclear program? So Phil, this was kind of a recommendation out of the Blue Ribbon Commission, as well as reports dating back to the 80s and even 70s that I mentioned. Last Congress, we had bipartisan legislation, S1234. I'm curious what your take is. What are the prospects that we'll maybe get legislation in this direction?
Well, I certainly think, when you start with the way you articulate it in the paper, which is that a single purpose entity is what's important here. The exact form of that is another question, whether it's like a government corporation. A private enterprise thing is possible, but let's be clear, everything's going to be regulated on the safety side and the licensing side. And if you're going to turn over money that's been collected in the Nuclear Waste Fund, or turn over the authority for them to collect money, that's a real political question. So I don't think there's any magical organizational form. You're going to want ultimate oversight. The public will demand it at some point if they think the company is not doing its work and it's got great powers to negotiate. And I don't know whether a state will feel comfortable negotiating just with a private entity. So I think that there's going to be some connection to the government. So you can, depends on what you call private enterprise, how private it is. It's going to need, but here again, what we do see with these two examples in the consolidated waste efforts to get licensed right now is this is the initiative of a private enterprise, but those private enterprises are actually in the business of decommissioning the current power plants that are shut down and trying to decide what to do with the waste that is stacking up, as one of the questioners was concerned, on these orphan sites around the country. And so this doesn't, I don't have an absolute answer for the person, but I'm just saying those are possibilities. Frankly, they're just going to be what's negotiated and tolerable by if an administration recommends it, or if a group of people agree upon which form it takes. But you can't, again, the question against the notion that, well, this would all work well if we just get it in the private sector and out of the public sector. This is too important for a lot of safety and financial and other reasons for it to be totally independent from the government.
Okay. I may ask Melanie a question I had on the WEEB recommendation I'd mentioned in the presentation regarding full-scale testing of transportation casks. That was something that WEEB had recommended. I'm just curious, your explanation, your view on why we might do that. What would be the value?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Thanks, Matt. So the Western Interstate Energy Board High-Level Radioactive Waste Committee does recommend full-scale cask testing of those transportation overpacks that would be used to move the canisters. And, you know, we've had some different people come from national labs and from the Department of Energy to kind of talk with us about how those designs are approved, and that the reasons why full-scale testing is not required for approval of those designs, which has to do with cost and also has to do with the advancements in modeling and, you know, that kind of manipulation of information. And I think that a key thing to think about is the public acceptance of a transportation program and how powerful it can be to take a transportation overpack and subject it to a series of, you know, fire tests and drop tests and everything like that, to have people actually see how robust it is and see how it survives. I mean, not only are you getting the advantage of actually testing that design in real life, which, you know, I'm a lawyer, I'm not an engineer, I don't work with modeling software, I kind of don't fully trust that you can reproduce the physical real world in a computer program yet. We're probably going to get there at some point. I don't think we're there yet. So there is some value in really testing the designs in real life from an engineering standpoint, I think, but also the public acceptance of the transportation program. To have a video of people being able to see that, I think would be invaluable. Perhaps not every cast design needs to be tested at full scale, but certainly some.
Okay, thank you. Okay, question from the audience. Besides trust, what about cost? How does nuclear waste management impact the LCOE of nuclear power? I don't know, does anyone want to take that?
LCOE?
The levelized cost of electricity is, I believe, what that acronym is going for.
Matt, I think it's really very small, but I don't have that data. And I remember we looked at it briefly in the BRC, but I don't think it's considered. I mean, it's costly, but you're making tons of money out of the selling of nuclear electrons. And so I think it's a percentage of cost and where the real investment is I think not large, but I could be wrong.
Was that question trying to address why nuclear power is not competitive and asking whether nuclear waste is?
Really asking like what slice of the levelized cost of electricity. I mean, the nominal rate out of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, it was set at 0.1 cents per kilowatt hour, but of course, without actual data on, this is my own view, without actual data on actually building a repository, you know, we don't know what the real cost will be.
But I think to Melanie's point, I don't hear it raised, and maybe I've missed it, as that, oh my goodness, we cannot build nuclear power plants because this adds so much to the financial cost. There are other big costs and other reasons that people oppose, but anyway.
I see one question on environmental justice. Can you speak about the environmental justice concerns of nuclear waste disproportionately affecting people of color and low-income communities? Anyone want to take that?
Well, just thinking of the place in WIP where we have direct experience, I haven't looked at the economic data of the area, but I don't think that it was picked because of sort of any easy place to stuff it because the local people would not have influence. I can't speak to the whole issue, but I really, I'm not sure that it's a serious question there. There are lots of other with the electric generation serious environmental justice questions.
Okay, I have a question. Can you talk about what is at stake long-term and short-term for the surrounding communities of these sites? For example, WIP.
Well, I'll tell you, it had a profound impact when we visited and we went down into the salt mine to where they put this stuff. And to be honest with you, it opened up my mind and others to a greater appreciation for what's possible, and both in what's possible and working with the community. So to my knowledge, this so far is turning out to be a benefit from there was an accident too that had to be dealt with. And so we have direct experience on how to deal with an accident and then recover from it. And now I haven't heard a lot since the recovery about local opposition, but I think probably it still is generally viewed as an engine for economics. Now, by the way, there are also some other nuclear facilities going on there. For example, the enrichment plant has been built there. But they've sort of made it, they lost out on potash. You have to remember economically, this is an area that no longer was mining potash, and they were trying to think, how else are we going to keep jobs and activity in our area? And somebody stumbled onto this. And it actually, from an economic point of view, has probably been a big plus.
All right, so we're approaching 3 o'clock. Maybe I'll ask two relatively quick questions from Melanie and Tito. There's a question: how do states get reimbursed for costs for preparing for spent nuclear fuel shipments that occur already? And another one about, will advances in waste vitrification research allow for new advances in storage technologies that ease storage safety, and I guess kind of along the lines of the new reactor technologies. So maybe to Melanie and Tito, final questions.
Sure. So I would say that the current spent nuclear fuel shipments, the limited number that move now, the states don't recover costs for the preparedness, any preparedness that they do for those. As far as I know, there's not a lot happening there necessarily. But certainly for the WIP transportation program, the Congress appropriates money for the preparedness activities and the coordination activities and everything that's associated with that, which was part of law that was passed. I think the Land Withdrawal Act kind of specified a lot of those activities. So it is something that needs to kind of have direction from Congress or appropriations from Congress to reimburse those activities. It's not as if we can just, send the federal government an invoice.
Okay, and Tito?
Certainly, I mean, there is, again, a lot of activity in terms of the R&D area associated with designing, better canisters, as we understand, we've looked at potential disposal alternatives, or complementary to a mine geologic repository. Borehole disposal is one that is being talked quite a bit about these days as a potential disposal method for small inventories of very, very specialized waste forms and things like that. So, I mean, we continue, pushing the state of the art in terms of R&D associated with, all three aspects: storage, transportation, and disposal. So it's not something, for the last 10 years, one of the advantages, you may call it so, of being in a lull, so to speak, with respect to actually disposing of waste is that we have 10 years of a lot of good R&D going on that has improved our understanding, by leaps and bounds in terms of behaviors, better understanding of behaviors in different geologic media, better canister designs, understanding transportation issues better from a technical perspective. So, it hasn't been wasted time, so to speak. So there's a lot of advances. The question is, when do we start incorporating that into a real program?
Okay, great. That's a good place to end. I really want to thank our speakers for joining us, and also thank you to our audience for tuning in. As we mentioned, the full video recording of this event will be available on the Center on Global Energy Policy's website in a few days. Our next event, Expanding Clean Energy Under the Biden-Harris Administration, Policy, Finance, and Women's Leadership, will be held this Thursday, March 4th at 5:45 p.m. Eastern Time. For a full calendar of upcoming events, please visit the Center on Global Energy Policy online. And we hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Take care.